China quietly monopolized the metal every U.S. fighter jet runs on. China controls 90% of the refining capacity for the metals inside every F-35, every Tomahawk missile, and every precision-guided bomb in the American arsenal. That is a larger chokehold than OPEC has ever held over oil. You heard that right. And the craziest part is not that China built this dominance, it is how they did it, in plain sight, over 30 years, while the West kept placing orders and asking no questions. And that is just the beginning. If that already has your attention, hit a quick like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how 17 obscure metals became the most powerful economic weapon ever aimed at the United States. Here is where it starts, with the metals themselves. What rare earths actually are. Picture your kitchen sponge. It sits under the sink. Nobody thinks about it, nobody talks about it until the day it isn't there. The word rare is misleading. These 17 metallic elements with names like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium are not rare in the ground. Some of them are actually more abundant in the Earth's crust than gold or silver. You can find them on nearly every continent. So if they're sitting in the ground all over the world, you might be wondering how one country ended up controlling almost all of them. Here is the part nobody talks about. Finding rare earths is not the problem. The problem is what happens next. To turn raw rare earth ore into something usable, you have to separate each individual element from a mixture of chemically almost identical materials. Think of it like trying to sort 17 different types of salt by taste alone, blindfolded, at industrial scale, without poisoning yourself in the process. The chemistry involved is extraordinarily complex. The waste it produces is radioactive. The facilities required are expensive to build and even more expensive to run safely. And the expertise needed to do it consistently, at volume, takes decades to develop. So when China offered to handle all of that cheaply, reliably, at scale, Western companies did not hesitate. Why would they? It made perfect economic sense. Outsource the dirty, complicated, expensive part. Keep the clean, profitable part. For 30 years, that logic held. By 2010, China was processing roughly 97% of the world's rare earth supply. To anchor that number, that is the equivalent of one country controlling the entire global production of steel, aluminum, and copper combined. Every Western factory, every defense contractor, every tech company was quietly threading their most critical supply chains through a single point of failure. And they knew. That is the part that makes this story so hard to stomach. But knowing about a vulnerability and understanding what it actually powers are two very different things. And what rare earth magnets actually power, that is what stops people cold. What the machines can't run without. Start with something simple. A refrigerator magnet, the kind you stick a grocery list to. Now imagine a magnet so powerful it can hold thousands of times that force in a package the size of your thumbnail. That is a rare earth magnet. And the reason it matters is not the magnet itself, it is everything that magnet makes possible. Walk through a single day in the modern world, and rare earth magnets are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Your phone vibrates in your pocket because of them. Your earbuds cancel noise because of them. The hard drive storing every photo you have ever taken spins because of them. That is just breakfast. Now here is the part that blows people's minds. Every electric vehicle motor running on American roads today uses between 4 and 11 pounds of rare earth magnets. There are roughly 3 million electric vehicles registered in the United States right now. 3 million vehicles, each one dependent on materials that pass through Chinese processing facilities before they ever reach an American factory floor. But the consumer story is not what keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. The F-35 fighter jet, America's most advanced, most expensive, most strategically critical aircraft, contains approximately 1,000 pounds of rare earth materials per plane. 1,000 pounds. That is roughly the weight of a grand piano, packed into a single aircraft, and every ounce of it depends on a supply chain Washington does not control. The United States currently operates around 450 F-35s. Do that math. and you are looking at over 200 million pounds of rare earth dependency flying in American airspace alone. And it is not just the aircraft. Every Tomahawk cruise missile uses rare earth magnets in its guidance fins. Every radar system that tracks incoming threats, every sonar array on every submarine sitting silently beneath the Pacific right now. The rare earth supply chain does not touch the edges of American military power. It runs straight through the center of it. Here is what most people never think about. Modern warfare is not one with steel and gunpowder anymore. It is one with precision. And precision, every single ounce of it requires rare earth magnets to function. Strip those out, and the most advanced military in human history starts to look a lot more like the ones it was built to defeat. So you now know what rare earths are. You know what they power, and you know the scale of the dependency. But the question nobody in Washington wants to answer out loud is how it got this bad. Because this was not an accident. It was not an oversight. It was a strategy announced openly, executed patiently, and ignored completely. And that story starts with 8 words spoken in 1992. How China played a 3-0-year game the West didn't know it was in. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping visited China's Inner Mongolia region and made a statement that was not a boast. It was a blueprint. He said, and these are his exact words, "The Middle East has its oil. China has rare earths." 8 words. 30 years later, those 8 words represent the most successful long-term strategic play in the history of modern geopolitics. Here is what makes this story so uncomfortable. China did not hide it. They announced it openly, in public, on the record. And the West heard it, noted it, filed it somewhere, and went back to ordering cheap magnets. To understand how China built this dominance, you have to go back further than 1992. In the 1950s and 60s, America was actually the world's dominant rare earth producer. A single mine in California, the Mountain Pass mine in the Mojave Desert, supplied the majority of the world's rare earth needs for decades. The United States had the ore, the processing facilities, and the expertise. It had everything. Then China entered the picture. Not with superior geology, not with a technological breakthrough. China entered with patience and price. Through the 1980s and 90s, Chinese producers, heavily subsidized by the state, began undercutting Western rare earth prices so aggressively that competing became economically irrational. Think of it like a global price war, where one side has an unlimited budget and the other side has shareholders. The outcome was never in doubt. Mountain Pass Mine closed in 2002. The American rare earth processing industry did not slow down. It essentially ceased to exist. Within a decade, China had moved from latecomer to monopolist, not by defeating Western producers in a fair competition, but by making Western production financially impossible. Now here is the part that most people get wrong about what China built. The mining was never the real prize. China understood something that Western strategists missed entirely, that the value was not in pulling ore out of the ground. The value was in what happened next, the separation, the refining, the magnet manufacturing. China spent 30 years building expertise, infrastructure, and institutional knowledge across every single layer of that process. They trained entire generations of chemical engineers. They developed proprietary separation techniques. They accumulated patents. By 2020, China was not just dominant in rare earth mining. It controlled 90% of global refining capacity and 90% of global magnet production. To put that in scale, that is a larger share of a critical global market than OPEC has ever held over oil, even at the absolute peak of its power. And here is the brutal catch. Every year of cheap Chinese rare earths was another year the West lost in building its own expertise. The gap was not staying the same. It was widening, quietly, continuously, compounding like interest on a debt nobody admitted they were taking on. China did not build a mousetrap. They built a supply chain so embedded in Western manufacturing that pulling it out would require dismantling the products themselves. The West had one warning, one chance to see exactly what was coming, and it let that warning pass too. The warning that already came and was ignored. In September 2010, A Chinese fishing trawler collided with two Japanese Coast Guard vessels near a disputed island chain in the East China Sea. It was a minor maritime incident. The kind that happens dozens of times a year in contested waters and usually disappears into diplomatic backchannels within weeks. What happened next was not minor. China responded by cutting off rare earth exports to Japan. No formal announcement, no official embargo, just a quiet administrative halt that stopped shipments from flowing. And within weeks, not months, not years, weeks, Japanese automotive and electronics manufacturers began sounding alarms. Production lines that depended on rare earth magnets were staring at empty shelves. Companies that had spent decades building just-in-time supply chains with zero redundancy were suddenly discovering they had no buffer, no alternative source, and no way to substitute the materials they needed. Here is what that moment revealed. Japan, one of the most technologically sophisticated, strategically aware nations on Earth, had allowed itself to become 90% dependent on Chinese rare earths. 90%. That is not a supply chain vulnerability. That is a chokehold with a polite name. The fishing trawler incident lasted only a few months before China quietly resumed exports, but the warning it delivered was deafening. For anyone paying attention, it was a live demonstration of exactly how a rare earth export restriction would play out against a modern industrial economy. The mechanism was proven. The leverage was real. The timeline from restriction to factory shutdown was measured in weeks, not years. Now here is the part that is almost impossible to believe. The West watched all of this happen. American policymakers, defense analysts, and supply chain experts observed a close ally nearly lose automotive production over a fishing boat dispute and did not fundamentally restructure their own rare earth dependency. There were reports. There were hearings. There were strongly worded recommendations. And then there were more cheap Chinese magnets flowing into American factories because the immediate economics were still too convenient to resist. Japan did respond. To its credit, Tokyo launched a serious, sustained, well-funded national effort to reduce its rare earth dependence on China. They invested in alternative suppliers. They funded recycling technology. They stockpiled reserves. They pursued rare earth projects in Australia, India, and Kazakhstan. It was exactly the kind of strategic response the moment demanded. 15 years later, Japan had reduced its dependence on Chinese rare earths from 90% to somewhere between 60 and 70%. 15 years of sustained national effort, billions of dollars spent, and the needle moved 30 points. Read that again slowly. 30 points in 15 years. That is the speed at which rare earth dependency can realistically be unwound even with genuine political will and serious money behind it. The United States, in 2010, was at roughly the same starting position Japan was. The same 90% dependence, the same structural vulnerability. The difference is, Japan started running in 2010, America largely did not. Which means by 2025, when China finally pulled the trigger on a full export restriction, America was not 15 years into its recovery. But here is the detail that transforms this from a trade dispute into something far more urgent. America's military was not sitting still while this played out. And the clock that started ticking in April 2025 is not a trade clock. It is a weapons clock. Why you can't just build your way out? Here is a question that sounds like it should have an easy answer. If rare earths are this critical, why doesn't America just build its own processing facilities and solve the problem? It is the first thing most people ask. It feels logical. It feels like the obvious move. And it is exactly the right instinct, which is why the actual answer is so frustrating. Think of rare earth separation like sourdough starter. You cannot just buy the ingredients and have it immediately. The recipe requires a living culture that has been fed, maintained, and refined over years. Miss a step and you are starting over. The expertise is not in the formula, it is in the accumulated judgment of everyone who has kept that culture alive through thousands of small daily decisions. The chemistry of separating individual rare earth elements from mixed ore is genuinely one of the most technically demanding industrial processes in the world. Each of the 17 elements has nearly identical chemical properties to its neighbors. Separating them requires hundreds of sequential extraction stages, using solvents, acids, and processes that have been refined through decades of continuous operation. The expertise lives in the people. not the equipment. And those people are in China. The process is environmentally catastrophic if mishandled. Rare earth ore contains naturally occurring radioactive materials. Processing it produces toxic and radioactive waste at scale. Western countries spent decades using environmental regulations, entirely justified ones, as a reason to offshore this processing to places with lower standards. Those regulations have not changed. Any new Western processing facility faces permitting timelines, environmental compliance costs, and community opposition that can stretch the path from announcement to operation to a decade or more. The Mountain Pass mine in California, the one that closed in 2002, was actually reopened. A company called MP Materials restarted operations and began producing rare earth concentrate again. That is real progress. But for years after reopening, they were shipping that concentrate to China for processing because the domestic separation infrastructure simply did not exist. They were mining American ore and handing it to the monopoly to finish. Here is the brutal catch that nobody in the optimistic press releases mentions. Even when a new separation facility is built, and several are now under construction, it takes years of continuous operation before the workforce develops the institutional knowledge to match Chinese efficiency. Consistency. You cannot hire your way to 30 years of expertise. You grow it, slowly, through production cycles and failures and adjustments that only come with time. And China knows this, which is why the most sophisticated countermove in their playbook is not an export ban, it is a price cut. Flood the market with cheap rare earths the moment a Western competitor approaches viability. Make the economics of the new facility impossible. Force the competitor to either run at a loss indefinitely or shut down. It worked against Mountain Pass in the 1990s. It remains a live threat against every new project being announced today unless Western governments commit to buying the output regardless of the market price, which is essentially asking taxpayers to subsidize a loss indefinitely in the name of national security. That is not a comfortable political sell, but it may be the only realistic one. Because the alternative is a military that cannot restock its most critical weapons, and that is not a hypothetical problem anymore. The military clock is already running. Here is something the trade war headlines kept burying underneath tariff percentages and negotiation updates. This stopped being an economic problem the moment the first precision munition flew over Iranian airspace. America's military does not stockpile weapons the way most people imagine. It is not a warehouse sitting somewhere with unlimited reserves, ready to replenish on demand. Think of it like a checking account, not a savings vault. You spend, you restock. You spend, you restock. The system works as long as the restock pipeline stays open. Close the pipeline, and the account drains. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that the conflict with Iran burned through more than half of America's pre-war inventory of some of its most expensive precision munitions, more than half. To put that in scale, the United States spends roughly $300 billion annually on defense procurement and maintenance, and a single regional conflict cut the precision weapons stockpile in half before the diplomatic cables had finished flying. Every one of those munitions needs rare earth magnets to be replaced, every Tomahawk that was fired, every guided bomb that found its target, every interceptor missile that did its job. The guidance systems, the fin actuators, the targeting mechanisms, all of it runs on rare earth magnets. And in April 2025, China made one thing explicitly clear in its export control announcement. Rare earths for use in American weapons systems are a red line, not a negotiating chip. A red line. Now, here is the detail that reframes everything you have heard so far. The broader trade negotiations between Washington and Beijing have moved. Tariff levels have shifted. China separated the economic leverage from the military leverage and applied them independently. That is not a blunt instrument. That is surgical. And it produced results almost immediately. Within weeks of the April restrictions, Detroit's automotive CEOs were standing in the White House telling the president that factory shutdowns were coming without Chinese material. If rare earth restrictions can bring car manufacturing to its knees in weeks, the timeline for precision weapons production is not longer, it is shorter. America is not facing a supply chain inconvenience. It is facing a weapons replenishment crisis with no short-term exit, no domestic substitute, and an adversary that understands exactly how much pressure to apply and exactly where to apply it. The West is not standing still. But what it is building and how long it will actually take is where the story gets equal parts hopeful and humbling. The West is fighting back, and here's the honest truth about whether it's working. The money is moving. That part is real. Australia's Lynas Corporation spent a decade building the only large-scale rare earth separation facility outside China, targeting 10,000 tons of separated material per year. 10,000 tons sounds significant until you learn that global demand is measured in hundreds of thousands of tons annually and growing. Lynas is a start. It is not a solution. Brazil is sitting on 1.5 billion tons of rare earth clay deposits backed by American funding, being developed by a company called Meteoric Resources. 1.5 billion tons is enough material to matter generationally. But ore in the ground and separated elements ready for magnets are separated by the exact processing bottleneck this entire video has been building toward. The deposit exists. The pipeline to turn it into fighter jet components does not yet. The Pentagon has taken a $400 million stake in MP Materials, pushing toward domestic heavy rare earth separation on American soil for the first time in a generation. Bloomberg Intelligence estimates $10 billion in public funds will flow into rare earth ventures outside China in 2026 alone. $10 billion. That is roughly the GDP of Iceland being redirected into a single supply chain problem in a single year. Here is what most people get wrong about all of this progress. Japan started this same fight in 2010. 15 years, billions of dollars, genuine national commitment. And Japan moved from 90% dependence on China to somewhere between 60 and 70%. That is the realistic speed of rare earth decoupling, even when everything goes right. America is not 15 years into that process. It is closer to the beginning than the middle. And the military situation it is managing right now does not have 15 years of patience built into it. Here is what this actually means for the world. The age of economic interdependence as a guarantor of peace, the idea that trading partners don't become adversaries because the cost is too high, is quietly ending. China did not build a trade weapon. It built a demonstration, proof of concept, that a determined nation with a long enough horizon and a willingness to absorb short-term costs can construct leverage so deep inside an adversary's industrial base that by the time the adversary notices, unwinding it takes longer than the crisis allows. 17 elements, 30 years, and the most powerful military on Earth asking Beijing for permission to rearm. If this changed how you think about who actually controls the global order, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the West can actually break China's rare earth monopoly within a decade, or has that ship already sailed?